The golden sun of Egypt spilled over the gleaming white stone of Alexandria, a city that hummed with the pulse of trade, culture, and ambition. Among the bustling markets filled with merchants shouting in Greek, Egyptian, and Latin, and the grand libraries where scholars debated the mysteries of the cosmos, one name whispered through the marble halls and down the dusty streets with both awe and fear: Cleopatra. Born of the Ptolemaic dynasty, she was not merely a queen, but a woman sculpted by destiny itself. Though her lineage traced back to Macedonian conquerors, she had molded herself into the living embodiment of Egypt. Draped in shimmering robes dyed with rare Tyrian purple, her presence commanded attention, but it was not only beauty that held people captive. Her voice, her wit, her command of languages, 9 in total, could sway hearts and minds as easily as the Nile flooded its banks. The palace she ruled from in Alexandria stood tall on the edge of the Mediterranean, its marble pillars rising like guardians of power. Yet behind the glitter of gold and the fragrance of incense, Cleopatra's reign was shadowed by fragility. Egypt was rich, yes, its grain fields feeding much of the Roman world, but it was also vulnerable, caught in the crushing grip of Rome's ever-expanding hunger. Within the palace, Cleopatra walked past mosaics depicting gods and pharaohs, her sandals clicking softly on polished floors. Servants bowed low, eyes averted, but their whispers followed her. Some calling her the savior of Egypt, others condemning her as manipulative and dangerous. She carried herself with unshakable grace, but even queens could feel the weight of uncertain thrones. Her court was a nest of serpents, rival siblings eager to seize her crown, advisors who shifted loyalty with the wind, and ambassadors from Rome whose smiles concealed sharp daggers of ambition. Cleopatra knew well that her power was not carved in stone. It was written in sand, shifting with every tide of politics. Yet in those uncertain days, her resolve shone bright. She was a queen who believed not only in ruling, but in weaving her name into the eternal fabric of history. She gazed across the Mediterranean horizon from her palace balcony, the wind lifting her hair as the setting sun painted the waters red and gold. "Egypt will not be a footnote," she whispered, as though promising the gods themselves. But the world beyond her marble walls was changing. In Rome, Julius Caesar, a man whose ambition stretched farther than empires, was embroiled in his own war for power. Their destinies, though oceans apart, were rushing toward collision. And so began the tale of Cleopatra, the queen who seduced empires, not merely with beauty, but with intelligence and resolve. Yet, as she rose higher, shadows lengthened behind her, whispering of betrayal, of battles yet to come, and of a fate that even the mightiest queen could not escape. Cleopatra's throne was a fragile seat, built on shifting sands of loyalty and treachery. From the moment she inherited the crown, danger lurked not in distant enemies alone, but in her own blood. The Ptolemaic dynasty was infamous for its rivalries, and Cleopatra's siblings were no exception. Her brother, Ptolemy VIII, was thrust upon the throne beside her as co-ruler, yet behind his youthful eyes burned the ambitions of advisors eager to use him as their puppet. In the dimly lit halls of Alexandria, whispers spread like fire. "The queen grows too bold," the courtiers muttered. "She speaks to the people as if she were their goddess." Cleopatra's decision to present herself not only as a Greek monarch, but as the living incarnation of Isis unsettled many in her court. To her subjects, she was divine. To her enemies, she was dangerous. Tensions thickened until they could no longer be contained. The conflict erupted when Ptolemy's advisors, greedy and fearful of Cleopatra's independence, orchestrated her exile. Soldiers loyal to the boy king stormed the palace one night, their bronze armor glinting in torchlight, their shouts echoing in the marble corridors. Cleopatra, unarmed and outnumbered, was forced to slip away into the desert, her once magnificent robes reduced to dust-stained garments as she fled under the cover of darkness. Exile was bitter, but it did not break her. She gathered loyal supporters in Syria, sharpening her plans like a blade. Yet Egypt was restless without her. Famine clawed at the land, Rome's shadow grew heavier, and the boy king's court spiraled into corruption. Even the Nile seemed to turn against Ptolemy's rule, its waters receding as if denying the young ruler its blessing. Meanwhile, far to the west, Rome's civil wars spilled blood across the Republic. Julius Caesar, triumphant over Pompey at Pharsalus, chased his rival into Egyptian waters. Pompey, seeking refuge, believed the boy king's court would offer safety. Instead, Ptolemy's advisors chose treachery. They lured Pompey to the shore, where assassins struck him down in cold blood. His severed head was presented to Caesar as a gift. But Caesar, far from being pleased, recoiled in disgust. He had wanted Pompey alive, to parade his enemy in chains, not to see him butchered by foreign hands. When he set foot in Alexandria, he found a kingdom boiling in chaos and a young monarch whose court was stained with dishonor. Cleopatra saw her chance. Rome's most powerful general was now within reach, and her path back to power lay through him. But entering Alexandria was perilous. Guards watched every gate, and Ptolemy's men would have killed her on sight. So she devised a daring plan, one that would become legend. Under the cover of night, Cleopatra sailed upriver and approached the palace by secret. Wrapped tightly in a coarse carpet, she was smuggled past the guards by her loyal servant Apollodorus. Carried like a parcel through the marble halls, she was set down before Caesar himself. The rug unfurled, and out stepped the exiled queen, her eyes gleaming with fire, her beauty unmasked by the simplicity of her disguise. "Cleopatra, Queen of Egypt," she said, bowing with grace. Caesar, hardened by years of war, found himself disarmed not by armies but by this woman's wit and courage. In that moment, alliances shifted. Yet, the choice to side with Cleopatra ignited a storm. Ptolemy and his advisors raged at Caesar's interference, and soon Alexandria became a battlefield. Roman legions clashed with Egyptian forces in the streets, their shouts mixing with the crackle of flames as parts of the great library burned. Cleopatra stood at Caesar's side, watching her city shudder under the weight of civil war, knowing that her future was being carved in blood and fire. But while Caesar's support restored her claim, it also bound her fate to Rome. The whispers that once haunted her palace grew louder. "She sells Egypt to the Romans," her enemies spat. "She is no queen, only Caesar's mistress." The people's adoration flickered, replaced by suspicion. Still, Cleopatra endured, her mind sharper than ever. She carried not only the hopes of a throne, but a secret ambition that stretched beyond survival. She had seen the weakness of men who underestimated her, and she would wield every weapon at her disposal, beauty, intellect, and cunning, to ensure Egypt's place in the world. Conflict was the crucible in which her reign was forged, and though she had clawed her way back from exile, the cost was clear. Her kingdom was now forever entangled with Rome's destiny, and in the shadows of victory, the question loomed: had she saved Egypt, or had she set it on a path that would one day consume her? The fires of Alexandria's civil war eventually smoldered into uneasy peace. Streets once filled with clashing swords and Roman banners now buzzed again with merchants and scholars, though the scars of battle lingered in the blackened stones of burned districts. At the center of it all stood Cleopatra. Restored to her throne with Caesar's backing, her brother Ptolemy V dead, drowned in the Nile during the chaos of war. The queen, who had been cast out in disgrace, now returned not as a fragile monarch, but as a ruler reborn in fire. By her side stood Julius Caesar, the most powerful man in the Roman world, whose presence in Egypt turned every whisper into speculation and every glance into scandal. To some, Cleopatra was a savior who had preserved Egypt against its enemies. To others, she was a temptress who had entangled Rome's greatest general in her silken web. Cleopatra cared little for the gossip. What mattered to her was survival, and survival demanded more than reclaiming her crown. It required ensuring Egypt's independence in a world where Rome devoured nations like lions devouring prey. In the cool chambers of the palace, lit by oil lamps that flickered against painted murals of gods and pharaohs, Cleopatra and Caesar dined together. Their conversations spilled far beyond politics. She spoke to him of the Nile's rhythms, of Egypt's ancient gods, of the mysteries written in hieroglyphs that Roman eyes could not comprehend. He, in turn, spoke of Rome's ambitions, its restless senate, its endless hunger for expansion. In Caesar, Cleopatra found more than a political ally. She found a man whose ambition mirrored her own, and soon their bond transcended politics. From that union came a child, Caesarion, little Caesar, a boy whom Cleopatra hailed as the heir not only to Egypt, but to Rome itself. She proclaimed him the son of Julius Caesar, daring to bind the fates of two empires through blood. The announcement sent ripples across the Mediterranean. In Rome, senators muttered darkly of Caesar's entanglement with the foreign queen. "She seeks to place her bastard on Rome's throne," they whispered. But Cleopatra saw only opportunity. Through her son, she imagined a new dynasty, one that could rule Egypt and Rome alike. She embraced this dream with all the passion of her spirit. Processions through Alexandria showed her not only as Isis reborn, but as the mother of a divine heir. Crowds cheered as she carried Caesarion in her arms, the child's small face veiled but radiant under the golden sun. To her people, she embodied renewal. To her enemies, she became more dangerous than ever. But fate was restless. Caesar, called back to Rome, left Egypt behind, though not without promises of protection. Cleopatra followed briefly, sailing up the Tiber to see Rome itself. There, her presence caused a scandal that shook the Republic. Senators fumed as Caesar lodged her in a villa, openly acknowledging her as his consort, and whispers spread that he intended to declare himself king with Cleopatra at his side. Yet destiny is a cruel sculptor. In the Ides of March, daggers struck Caesar down beneath the shadow of Pompey's statue. Rome convulsed in chaos once more, and Cleopatra, far from home, found herself stranded in a city that suddenly saw her as a foreign threat. Fearing for her life and her sons, she fled back to Egypt, carrying only the memory of the man who had altered her fate. Back in Alexandria, she mourned but did not break. Instead, she turned her gaze to the shifting tides of Roman politics. The Republic crumbled, replaced by a struggle between Caesar's assassins and his loyalists. Among those who rose to power was Mark Antony, a general whose charisma rivaled his strength, and whose loyalty to Caesar's legacy brought him into Cleopatra's orbit. When Antony summoned her to meet him, Cleopatra did not come as a supplicant. She sailed down the river on a barge gilded with gold, its sails of purple silk billowing in the wind, its oars moving in rhythm like the heartbeat of destiny. Reclining beneath a canopy, adorned as the goddess Isis, she presented herself not as a queen pleading for favor, but as a living deity commanding devotion. Antony, famed for his conquests, found himself conquered in turn. From that moment, their fates entwined. Their partnership was more than passion. It was a union of ambition. Together they envisioned a world in which Rome and Egypt would not be master and servant, but equals, bound through their love and through the children they would bring into the world. Cleopatra's palace echoed once more with laughter and music, with the sound of children's footsteps and the plotting of empire. She and Antony divided their time between revels of indulgence and the forging of alliances. To their followers, they were gods on earth. To their enemies, they were a threat to Rome itself. In the corridors of power, Cleopatra's name was once again a storm on the horizon. She had survived exile, civil war, and the assassination of Caesar. Now she stood not only as Egypt's queen, but as the partner of one of Rome's most powerful men. Her dream of creating a dynasty that could rival Rome's seemed closer than ever. But ambition is a dangerous flame, and with every rise comes the shadow of the fall. Beyond the Nile, in Rome's Senate, a new leader rose, Octavian, Caesar's adopted son. Where Cleopatra saw Antony as her equal, Octavian saw him as an obstacle, and in the shadow of their love, a war for the world was beginning to take shape. The queen who had once whispered promises to the gods from her balcony now stood on the edge of history's most perilous gamble. She had seduced empires, she had forged alliances with legends, but soon she would face the greatest test of all, a battle not only for her throne, but for her very survival. The union of Cleopatra and Mark Antony blazed like a torch across the Mediterranean world. In Alexandria, their court became a spectacle unlike any other, a place where wine flowed, poets sang of immortal love, and the queen and her Roman general lived as gods among mortals. Together they proclaimed themselves Dionysus and Isis, lord of revelry and goddess of rebirth, their images carved into coins and etched into memory. To their followers, it was a golden age of passion and power. To their enemies, it was blasphemy. For in Rome, whispers turned to roars. "Antony has betrayed us," cried the Senate. "He kneels before an Eastern queen, and together they dream of ruling not just Egypt, but Rome itself." At the head of these voices was Octavian, Caesar's adopted son, whose ambition burned as fiercely as Cleopatra's. Octavian painted Antony as a traitor, bewitched by the Egyptian queen's charms. He spread tales of Cleopatra's decadence, of feasts where pearls were dissolved in wine, of orgies that mocked Roman virtue. Yet beyond the propaganda lay a real and terrifying truth. Antony and Cleopatra were building an empire within an empire, and their heirs, Caesarion and their own children, threatened to eclipse Octavian's claim to power. Inevitably, war followed. The summer sun of 31 BCE bore down on the Ionian Sea as fleets gathered near the promontory of Actium. On one side, Octavian's disciplined legions and the cunning Admiral Agrippa, their ships lean and ready for war. On the other, Antony's vast but unwieldy fleet, bolstered by Cleopatra's Egyptian warships, adorned with gilded prows that glimmered like fire upon the water. From the decks, Cleopatra watched as her ships spread across the horizon. She wore armor beneath her royal robes, a golden diadem upon her brow. Antony stood beside her, his once unshakable confidence shadowed by doubt. They had chosen to risk everything here, love, empire, and life itself. The battle began with the roar of rams striking hulls, with fire arrows streaking across the sea, and with the cries of men locked in desperate combat. For hours, the outcome teetered. Antony's forces, though larger, faltered under the relentless strikes of Agrippa's more agile ships. Smoke choked the air, and the sea turned red with blood. Then came the moment that sealed their fate. Cleopatra, fearing capture and destruction, signaled her fleet to break away. With sails unfurled, her golden ships turned southward, retreating from the chaos. Antony, seeing her depart, was torn between command and devotion. In that fateful instant, love triumphed over duty. Abandoning his men, Antony leapt into a small vessel and pursued Cleopatra, leaving his fleet leaderless. The battle collapsed. Octavian claimed victory, and Antony's remaining ships surrendered or were destroyed. The dream of an Eastern empire, the dream of Cleopatra's dynasty, shattered upon the waves of Actium. But the story did not end there. Back in Alexandria, Cleopatra and Antony retreated into the splendor of the palace, their revels now hollow echoes of glory past. Once their halls had been filled with laughter and the music of triumph. Now they resounded with silence and the creeping dread of defeat. Octavian marched inexorably toward Egypt. His legions swept through the land like a storm, and with each step, hope withered. Yet Cleopatra, even in despair, did not yield. She sent envoys offering peace, offering treasure, even offering her crown if her children might be spared. But Octavian's answer was iron. He would accept nothing less than absolute submission. For Antony, humiliation cut deeper than any sword. Once a general of Rome, now abandoned, he watched his power crumble, his honor mocked. Rumors reached him that Cleopatra, ever cunning, was negotiating secretly with Octavian. In a storm of grief and rage, Antony believed himself betrayed. In August of 30 BCE, he heard the false report. Cleopatra was dead. Stricken with despair, Antony drew his sword and fell upon it, mortally wounding himself. His soldiers carried him to Cleopatra, who still lived hidden within her mausoleum. There, in the arms of the queen he loved, Antony breathed his last. His final words were of honor, of regret, and of eternal devotion. Cleopatra's grief was beyond measure. She shut herself within her tomb, surrounded by the treasures of Egypt, gold, jewels, the relics of her ancestors, preparing for death as though it were a coronation. Octavian entered Alexandria triumphant, but he knew that capturing Cleopatra alive would be the crowning jewel of his victory. Alive, she would be paraded in chains through Rome, a broken queen displayed as a conquered prize. But Cleopatra, queen of Egypt, goddess of Isis, would not suffer such humiliation. She resolved to choose her own end. On a sweltering August day, she dressed in her finest robes of white linen, adorned herself with the serpent diadem of the pharaohs, and reclined upon her couch within the mausoleum. At her side were two handmaidens loyal until the end. In a basket of figs lay hidden the asp, the sacred cobra. With calm dignity, Cleopatra reached for the serpent. The asp struck, its venom swift and merciless. As the poison coursed through her veins, she lay back, serene, her gaze fixed upon the eternal horizon. One by one, her maidens followed her into death. When Octavian entered, he found not a captive queen to humiliate, but a lifeless goddess who had denied him the triumph he craved. Cleopatra lay as though in eternal sleep, her face radiant, her body untouched by fear. In that moment, she won her final victory, not over Rome, but over fate itself. The last pharaoh of Egypt was gone. With her death, a dynasty that had lasted for centuries crumbled into dust. Octavian would return to Rome as Augustus' first emperor, and Egypt would become a province of the Roman Empire. Yet Cleopatra's story did not vanish. Instead, it burned into legend, a queen who loved too fiercely, who dreamed too greatly, and who chose death over surrender. Her life had been a dance with destiny, each step a gamble, each embrace a defiance. She had seduced empires, commanded armies, born heirs who might have ruled the world. And though her dream of an eternal dynasty collapsed, her name endured, whispered in palaces, sung in plays, immortalized in history. Cleopatra had lost her kingdom, her lover, and her life. But she had won something rarer than victory: immortality in memory. When the news of Cleopatra's death spread, the ancient world shuddered. The Queen of Egypt, whose beauty and cunning had ensnared the greatest men of Rome, was gone. Yet her end was not the silence of defeat, but the roar of defiance. She had robbed Octavian of his triumph, refusing to be paraded like a trophy in the streets of Rome. In dying on her own terms, Cleopatra secured her legacy as more than a queen. She became a symbol. For Octavian, the moment was bittersweet. He had won Egypt, the jewel of the Mediterranean, and with it the wealth that would fuel his rise as Augustus, the first emperor of Rome. Yet even in victory, Cleopatra overshadowed him. Rome remembered her not as a captive, but as a sovereign who had chosen dignity over disgrace. The power she wielded in life now transformed into myth, beyond the reach of any conqueror. In Egypt, her people mourned. Temples filled with offerings, prayers rose to the heavens, and songs of lament echoed along the Nile. To them, Cleopatra was not just a ruler, but the living embodiment of Isis, a goddess who had protected Egypt until the very end. Her death marked not only the fall of a dynasty, but the end of an era. With her, the ancient world of pharaohs breathed its last. Yet Cleopatra's story did not vanish into the sands. In Rome, poets whispered of her courage. In later centuries, playwrights would dramatize her passions, artists would paint her death, and historians would debate her choices. She became a figure of fascination, part femme fatale, part tragic heroine, part sovereign undone by love and ambition. Was she a seductress who bewitched men into ruin, or a queen who fought desperately to protect her throne and her children? Was she reckless in her gamble against Rome, or was she the last defender of Egyptian independence in the face of an unstoppable empire? The truth lies somewhere between these visions, blurred by the passage of time. What is certain is this: Cleopatra refused to be ordinary. She refused to bow. Even when fate closed in, she faced it not as a prisoner but as a queen. Her life, filled with triumphs and tragedies, reminds us that power and love are forces that can elevate or destroy, often at the same time. And there is a deeper lesson, one that outlives empires. Cleopatra's story teaches us that true greatness is not measured only by conquest or longevity, but by the indelible mark one leaves upon the world. Rome conquered Egypt, Octavian became Augustus, and centuries rolled on. Yet when we speak of the grandeur of Rome, we also speak of Cleopatra. Her name has never been erased. Even now, millennia later, she lives on in plays, in poetry, in cinema, in the collective imagination of humanity. She is remembered not as a victim of fate, but as a woman who dared to dream beyond the limits of her age, who sought to bend empires with her will, and who embraced death with the dignity of a queen. Cleopatra could not escape her fate, but in embracing it, she ensured that her story would echo forever. And so, while kingdoms rise and fall, while empires vanish into dust, her legacy endures, a reminder that passion, ambition, and defiance are powers no conqueror can fully extinguish. Cleopatra, last pharaoh of Egypt, remains eternal.